Hi, I'm Dhanaraj Thakur from the Center for Democracy and Technology, and this is Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I am your host, Kerry Parker. And today we have episode 250. It's a very nice round number for December 13th, 2021. And today we're going to be talking with, as you might have guessed, Dhanaraj Thakur, who is from the Center for Democracy and Technology, who I don't think I've ever had on the show before. That is a representative from CDT, but I've wanted to have on for a long time. So anyway, it's great to have him here. We're going to be talking about how basically our surveillance capitalist society, corporate surveillance that is, how we kind of trade for all these quote unquote free products, has enabled end runs around our rights, at least here in the United States, to privacy and due process. Basically, our law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies would normally have to get warrants or go through some legal process to access some of this very personal data, except now they don't have to. They can just go buy it like everybody else does. But anyway, I don't want to give away too much of that. We're going to talk about that today. But it's all because of a report that just dropped, and it came out last Thursday, I think. And I was privileged enough to get an embargoed copy of that a little bit early so I could get ready for this interview. And this all came about because I went to a webinar a couple months ago called the Patriot Act Turns 20. Hard to believe it's been 20 years since that was passed. And I think it was hosted by CDT. But anyway, at that session, I was listening to it, and I've got a link in the show notes. You really might want to check it out. It was a very interesting discussion. It was started off with a little talk from Russ Feingold, a senator who had a lot of influence back in the day before he retired and was around for the Patriot Act and was one of the few who pushed back against it. Anyway, I thought it was a fascinating discussion. But toward the end of that discussion, they were taking Q&A, and the way you did it was you'd post a question in the chat window, and then the moderator would look through those and pick one to read, and they picked mine. And it turns out that the CDT's representative there, Sharon Bradford Franklin, basically said I promise this wasn't a plant. I didn't plant this question myself, because she then turned around and said, yeah, we're actually writing a report right now that's going to be out later this year about that very question. And so, of course, at that point, I had to reach out to them and say, hey, I'd love to interview about, someone from CDT about this. And, that process took some time. We finally got it together last week and timed it around the release of the report. And now we have this interview. So before we get to that interview, real quick, a couple news items. First of all, again, if you're still shopping for gifts, man, you better get on it, because shipping is going to be tough this year. But if you're still looking for gifts, I guess you can always go to brick and mortar too, right? Be sure to check out my best and worst gift guide. You can find it on the website, firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. And I have been updating it. In fact, I recently added some stuff based on some news articles about some just horrendous, quote-unquote, smart devices for kids. And you should be aware of any toys that you buy for young kids that connect to the internet. But there's some really nasty ones that I've ran across some articles on, so I had to put those on the list. Also, we'll have a new show next week. I've got a lot to catch you up on there. Verizon just kicked off this customer tracking program and automatically enrolled everyone. Very nice of them to do so. I'll talk about that next week, though if you're a newsletter subscriber, then last night you already got a little preview of what I'll be talking about there. But there's going to be a lot of stuff to catch you up on next week. And I've got some other stuff to pass along. So anyway, I'll talk about that after the interview. Now, for this interview, the only thing I'll mention real quick here is that we talk about, and we do expand, ECPA, or the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. But Donnarus does often refer to it as ECPA. So when he's throwing around ECPA, he's talking about the ECPA. All right, so let's get right to that interview with Dhanaraj Thakur. Dhanaraj Thakur is a research director at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where he leads research that advances human rights and civil liberties online. Welcome to the show, Dhanaraj.
Thank you, Kerry. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk a little bit today about a really important report you guys just released. What I'd like to do to start off is tell me a little bit more about yourself and the Center for Democracy and Technology. And then if you would, maybe give us an overview of this report. And I'm mostly curious, where did you get some of the data from this report? How did you collect the information that went into this report?
Yeah, sure. So I'm with the Center for Democracy and Technology. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We also have our office in Brussels, and we primarily focus on technology policy issues and really I try to advocate for policies that will protect people's rights online. And we do that in many different areas, like in terms of privacy, in terms of free expression, in terms of civic technologies, cybersecurity, and so on, and also in terms of security and surveillance. Mm-hmm. And one of the areas that is of a lot, significant concern for us is law enforcement intelligence agencies' access to personal data. And that's what led to, this area that we've been working for a while, and it led to the genesis of this report and really trying to understand the scale and the extent to which law enforcement intelligence agencies are purchasing personal data, like our, from me and you, our personal data from brokers, and how they do this by effectively doing an end run around existing legal requirements. So that is a big concern for us. And so we wanted to examine that problem and also illustrate the scale of which is happening and try to put forward ways we could address it.
Yeah. And it's a really stunning report, and really happy to dig into that today with you. First of all of this starts with the rampant data collection and in the aftermarket for user information. That's kind of the way unfortunately the way our internet economy works today. And I think most people today are finally aware of the data collection part, but the world of data brokers is still a mystery, and honestly, it's probably deliberately opaque. And, so even if people try to follow it, it's going to be hard to follow. So can you give us an overview maybe of the data broker ecosystem? Let's start with understanding what these companies are collecting and sharing and trading and how that market kind of functions behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's a great question. There is so much to say here. Yeah. But I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talk about like how it's really difficult to understand. In general, there's just a high degree of opacity here, and things are just not transparent. And in many cases, they're deliberately not transparent. Mm-hmm. We know that there are these different entities, data brokers, and in the report we kind of define them basically as businesses that knowing to collect, purchase, maybe analyze or collate personal data without having a direct relationship with the people whose data they're collecting, right? Mm-hmm. And ultimately with a goal of selling that data to other entities. And there are hundreds, maybe thousands of these different kinds of businesses that function as data brokers on many different scales. Some are very large, which we already know about, like Equifax or these very large scale brokers, and some that we've never heard of. And I mean, in the general public is not familiar with, which we mentioned in the report, or which are also quite large, but we're not familiar with. Entities like Ventel or Giant Oak or others. And I think we have to recognize that this ecosystem, this industry emerges from what is in effect a lack of, federal privacy regulations. So it's really, in many cases, they're working on unregulated space, right? And because of that, it goes back to this lack of transparency. We're not actually clear how data brokers always get their information and data from. We know that they pull from many sources, including possibly other data brokers, but it's not always clear what is that kind of clear supply chain from the person producing content online or sharing content online to eventually end up with a data broker. One example though is with mobile apps. So a lot of us use various many different apps on our phones. A lot of these apps will have language in their service agreements or terms of that say that they will share that data with other third parties, so to speak. They will share it with these third parties who may be data brokers or other aggregators being entities that basically compile or collate different people's data, and then who then sell it on to brokers. And brokers now will do further analysis or share that with other organizations who are looking to have a better understanding of people's personal information. And that could include law enforcement, and which is how we ended up with this report, law enforcement intelligence agencies. So yeah, it's not quite transparent how this whole ecosystem works. And it's complicated by the fact that the data broker does not directly interact with URI, right? But many intermediate players along the way, which complicates and obfuscates what's really going on.
Yeah. In the U.S., we have some fundamental rights to privacy that are enshrined in the Constitution, for example, the Fourth Amendment, and, maybe to some degree, the Fifth Amendment. And since our framers obviously couldn't have foreseen things like cell phones and the internet, we've obviously had to extend those rights or refine those rights over the years via regulation and, case law, legislation. But in your report, you find that, that many of these legally established rights to privacy and due process are basically being circumvented.
Right.
Where it comes to, things like law enforcement and intelligence agencies, having access to this data. So maybe give us an overview of, the relevant protections that you believe are being sidestepped here by law enforcement and these intelligence agencies.
We can look at this on two levels. I think one of the most significant pieces of legislation is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986. And I think the year is significant here of when it was implemented, which was several decades ago. So this act, ECPA, what it essentially does, it provides like a legal structure for when and how government can access communication data that's provided by certain kinds of service providers, right? Providers that provide some kind of communication service or some kind of computing service, right? So think of like your ISPs, for example. What it says is that it prohibits those kinds of providers from providing data to law enforcement without the government obtaining adequate legal process, like getting a search warrant, for example, right? And in most cases, it will protect like people's like sensitive data. But what it does allow is for those same providers to voluntarily share non-content data, so things like location data, right, or other kinds of metadata, with third parties who are not government, i.e. data brokers, right? So if those third parties are not covered by ECPA, in other words, they're not providing a communication service or a computing service, right, as defined by ECPA, they can sell that data to anyone, including law enforcement intelligence agencies. And so what that means then is that we have this kind of loophole in the law, right? Whereas at one level, it's prohibiting the providers from directly providing data to law enforcement without a search warrant, for example. But it allows these third parties that are not covered by it to sell that same data to law enforcement. And this is one of the big loopholes that is well known, and we kind of reiterate that in the report. There's a more recent landmark case on Carpenter versus the United States, which tried to address a part of this problem. So in Carpenter, the court essentially held that a warrant is required for law enforcement to access historical cell site location information, right? So when you use a phone, your position or your location could be recorded because of which cell site you're using at the time. Your phone is connected to at the time. So a warrant is required for law enforcement to access that kind of location information for a period of 7 days or more. That's what the court said, right? And basically, it was saying that accessing that location information from anybody. In other words, it was saying that ECPA's standard was insufficient by just limiting it in the way it was limited to certain kinds of providers. Why? Because the court in Carpenter argued that location information can really reveal a lot about our personal private life, right? It can tell someone where your families are, your political association, religious, sexual association, and so on. So the court was arguing that this kind of deep, intimate knowledge about someone's private life should not be available without a warrant. So that was a landmark finding, and from our point of view at CDT, we argue that kind of analysis and language should extend beyond just cell site location information. Because think about it, all of our activities online now, we do so much online, it reveals so much about us. It doesn't just have to be our location or IP address, but everything else can reveal so much about our private life. In the same way that the Supreme Court was recognizing at the time that cell site location information can reveal so much about our intimate lives. So we argue that kind of analysis should extend beyond cell site location information. However, law enforcement agencies, and intelligence agencies have already put out and stated that they have adopted a very narrow interpretation of Carpenter and believe that the case does not apply into their transactions with the data brokers. So there's that loophole in ECPA, and now we have this kind of narrow interpretation of Carpenter, which law enforcement and intelligence agencies are arguing does not prevent them from purchasing location or other personal data from data brokers. So there are these two levels there. We find that law enforcement intelligence agencies are essentially, circumventing legal requirements.
Yeah. Wow. So, in your report, you give several examples of contracts between law enforcement agencies and these data brokers, and how you got those, I'd love to know. But in these contracts, they use some terminology quite obviously over and over again. Some of them being like publicly available data or open source information. So first, since they're obviously almost making these terms of art, what do those terms really mean? Do they have any sort of a legal connotation that's important here, or are they just kind of loosely defined and they're kind of playing on the fact that they're loosely defined? And second, they imply that the information is basically simply available for anybody to obtain. And if that's the case, what's the real concern here?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And one of the key things we point out in our report, and you're right, a lot of the solicitations, requests for proposals from these law enforcement intelligence agencies, seeking these kinds of personal data or data broker services will include terms like open source and publicly available. And it would give the impression that they are actually seeking publicly available information, which maybe could be publicly available to any one of us, and may therefore not be as concerning, because if it's already publicly available, if you post something on Twitter, each tweet has a public URL, and the government is looking for that, and why should we be concerned from a privacy perspective? But I think that's not what they mean, and this is the problem. In one solicitation where they use the term open source, it was referring to data that could include someone's internet footprint, for example, data used to create user accounts, phone numbers, GPS information, mobile phone platform like the operating system you're using, social media identification handles like Twitter, Tumblr, Snapchat, etc., WhatsApp identification, etc. So, in one sense, when you read that, it's clear that this is not all open source or publicly available information, right? If someone had the budget to go and acquire the information, that may be the case. I mean, and you'd have to have an extensive budget, say, for example, like these law enforcement agencies. But these are not data points that are publicly available in the sense that you and I might understand it. So the problem is that these terms are being used in a very specific sense, but not in a way that's understood by the public at large.
So the real problem here is that this, and the crux of this whole issue, as far as I'm concerned, is that we have, as a culture, as a society, decided that we are willing to trade all this information for these quote unquote free services. And so these private companies are collecting this data, and it's available to amongst themselves and amongst these data brokers and marketers and advertisers. And so law enforcement and intelligence agencies are just saying, well, hey, it's right there. And I think one of the points that they bring up, and like you would kind of address, is they're saying, well, foreign intelligence agencies and foreign law enforcement can get this stuff. They can go buy this stuff on the open market. So if they can do it, why can't we? I mean, I think that's a valid argument, and it obviously points to the bigger problem. But how do we argue, or maybe how do you guys argue, that we should prevent our own law enforcement agencies from accessing data that any other agency in some other country could buy just as easily?
Right, and that is an argument you hear, but we have to keep in mind that all law enforcement intelligence agencies are subject to the U.S. Constitution and the laws in this country, right? And so because of that, we have to be aware of rules of legislation like ECPA, and of the Carpenter decision, and of the rules that are in place to protect people's privacy. So the fact that foreign entities may be transacting with data brokers to get personal data of Americans is definitely a big problem, but that does not open the gates for domestic law enforcement intelligence agencies to follow suit, right? We do have to protect the rights of Americans here. And that is one of the key things we argue in the report as well, that there are certain rights that we have to protect, constitutional rights, and others that we need to protect, and that should apply in this case as well.
Yeah. I completely agree. It just seems like such a thorny problem, but yeah, and obviously that's one of the things that your report is highlighting. So part of the problem with a lot of these things is, and I love the term surveillance capitalism. It was a book that came out recently, and I think that term is taking root, and it truly is. Right. This corporate data collection, it really does amount to surveillance. And while, a lot of people think, I don't care if they, sure, I want to see better ads. but what we've uncovered here with your report and what we've been talking about today is that what that really does enable is actually true surveillance by the government in a way that, makes it and run around our regular privacy rights that are enshrined in the Constitution and otherwise. And I worry, about agencies like the Border Patrol or ICE, using this data, which we haven't really talked about them yet. So in your reporting and in your investigation for this, did you run across any troubling examples or things around surveillance, like human surveillance, that has been enabled by this sort of market?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, right? Because I think, and what we've discussed so far and what we attempt to highlight in the report is that the fact that law enforcement intelligence agencies can evade these existing rules and purchase this kind of personal data, there's serious privacy concerns because this data reveals a lot about people. It's very sensitive, intimate, and so on. But it also can have disproportionate impact on certain communities, right? And you mentioned ICE, Border Patrol, and so on. There was an example which we cited in our report of how the development of a Muslim prayer app on your mobile phones was sending data to different aggregators and third parties and so on. And through that series, ended up with a data broker that in turn sold that data to ICE, who then use that kind of intimate personal data in their investigations and so on. But the point is it can be data that targets specific communities in a disproportionate way. And these communities are, as others are discussed in like other research, and even those my colleagues at CDT have pointed out, this kind of surveillance capitalism and government surveillance that you're talking about has disproportionate impacts on communities of color and immigrant communities. And this example of the Muslim prayer, mobile app is just another illustration of that. So these concerns, the problem that we're illustrating in the report should concern us all, but we should also be worried that there could be, additional negative impacts on other communities of color and immigrant communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So how are they getting this data? Just, I'm curious. Are they contracting with data brokers in the sense, are they getting access to APIs that these, like in Cambridge Analytica, I know this doesn't quite apply here, but basically Facebook had these open APIs for third parties to do supposedly research. And this other company did research, but they ended up using it for political purposes, which was against the terms of service and, yada, yada, yada.
Right.
But when it comes down to it, like, are they buying data packages? Are they downloading historical data in data dumps? Are they actually getting live real-time access to, data broker information? Like, how are these guys getting this information? What form is it taking?
We should talk a bit more maybe later on about what kinds of sources we found and the difficulties around that. Because like I mentioned at the start, it was very difficult to kind of unearth what's happening here, right?
Yeah.
But so one of the examples that we came across frequently was, law enforcement intelligence agencies purchasing like subscription services to databases. So one database, for example, claimed, this is Forensic Logic's CopLink X, which claims, for example, that they draw on 3,225 different individual data sources and have 1 billion law enforcement records of people in the U.S., right? Of different kinds of records that through a subscription service, a law enforcement agency can have access to, and then presumably retrieve data for different purposes or different investigations that they're pursuing. So in many cases, we saw this kind of thing. And what we found in just looking at the different types of services that law enforcement is trying to pursue, and we infer this based on the kinds of solicitations that they're putting out. There are four broad categories. One is really around geolocation data, right? So where the specific location of a mobile device. And this is the kind of data that many different brokers will provide. So that was quite common. Another category is around metadata and communications data. So that includes like, not so much just location information, but, when was a message sent and to how many people, and maybe the size of the message, that kind of thing. So that's another area. And then I think another one that's probably might resonate more with everyday people is license plate reader data. So this is essentially these kinds of systems, you have various kind of computerized camera systems that essentially capture license plates information of vehicles on the road, and they'll record like the location, the date, the time, etc., of when the license plate information was captured, maybe by a camera. Incorporating that in different databases, provide that as a service again to different agencies, and so that's another huge area of focus for a lot of these. There are other areas as well, but including, for example, utility data and others. But in effect, a lot of the solicitations looked at these, and a lot of it involved trying to get subscriptions to databases that provided these kind of information, so that the agencies could then have access to it whenever they needed it.
Transparency is a huge problem when it comes to data collection in the United States, and perhaps anywhere outside the EU at this point, since they've got GDPR and we don't. But, that is, most people are blissfully unaware of what data is being collected and with whom it's being shared. However, most of this is being done by private corporations for proprietary endeavors, right? But should we expect more transparency and accountability when it comes to public and governmental agencies? And, what's the reality there?
Yeah, I think we definitely need more transparency, particularly with what's happening here in terms of transactions between law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and data brokers. As I've alluded to earlier, it was in trying to research this topic, it was very difficult. So first of all, what we tried to do was to look for publicly available information, as in requests for proposals, solicitations, awards, or other kinds of contracts between law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and data brokers. And we found very little, to be honest with you. In fact, I would argue that what we've touched on in this report, where we looked at about 150 different documents, we found awards in about 30 that we could confirm the amounted to about 86 million. I would argue that's just the tip of the iceberg, that we're barely able to really find anything based on this kind of limited public search.
Now, are these documents available? Like, is there a government website I could go to right now to just look these things up? Or did you have to go, do a Freedom of Information Act kind of a thing here? How did you get a hold of this?
Right. These are publicly available. So you could go to USAspending.gov or similar kinds of databases. The thing is, even if you did that, it wouldn't be so easy. You'd have to be looking for specific kinds of keywords.
Shocking.
You'd have to know what you're looking for, in other words. And even then, it's still difficult. And the reason I say that is because, think back to our discussion on open source, what's publicly available, the terminology is not always clear, right? Even the documents that we found, they lack clarity on like the specific nature of the contract that they have in question. I mean, it's clear that it involved the transaction of their own personal data, but what kinds of personal data, and for which period, and for which for what population are we talking about, it wasn't always clear. So that leads to a couple of things. It seems by intent that it's really hard to understand what's happening because of the lack of transparency in the language. Some data brokers actually, for example, when we kept one data broker, Babel Street, for example, had in its own terms of service, had a disclosure saying that its services should not be used as a basis for any kind of legal process in any country, including as a basis for a warrant, subpoena, etc. So that term is also preventing any greater transparency in what kinds of transactions are being engaged in here. A lot of it is just highly attenuated and shrouded in secrecy, right? On the flip side, because these data brokers are providing a service, they have to advertise those services.
Right.
So what you can do, and what we did do, is to look at the types of what the brokers themselves claim to be providing. And through that, we could come across different like brochures and websites, these are all public, that could tell us what does the service provide. Like one example is LexisNexis, their digital identity network, which claims to create a unique digital identity for each user based on their devices, locations, and anonymized personal information. So things like that tells us that these are services, and this is what the services contain, and these are, and through our documentation, we found that law enforcement and different intelligence agents are engaged in transactions or service subscriptions to these particular kinds of databases. So in that way, we could get a sense of what data is provided through those subscription services. But this is not easy. And none of this involved like what you had mentioned, like FOIA requests now, which would be our next step, I think, in introducing a lot more clarity into what's going on here. So basically, I think we just, like I said, this is tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on here that we're not aware of. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because these are government agencies, right? These are not private entities.
So are you saying that you got the distinct impression that they're being deliberately opaque, like that they are trying to avoid inspection by the general public or by rights groups like yourselves? Do you think that they're obfuscating deliberately in order to escape notice?
Yes. And this is happening at different levels. I mentioned how some data brokers themselves will restrict the way that you can discuss the contracts you have with them. But the government agencies, the law enforcement intelligence agencies are also quite vague in the description that they provide in these kinds of the documentation around awards and so on. So it's very hard to know exactly what kinds of services and data are being purchased here. So yes, I think it's quite unclear, and a lot more could be done in terms of better transparency.
In your report, you mention some bills that are currently in front of Congress and some efforts to try to rectify some of the problems that you've uncovered. What are some of those current bills that are being proposed to address the issues outlined in your report? And in your view, how well do they address these concerns?
I think one main one that we should mention here is the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, which we actually highlight also in our report and suggest that as a way forward. And the reason for that, I'll say briefly mention, is that it seeks to address this loophole in ECPA that we discussed earlier on, right? Deliberately so, right? Because it recognizes the problem around this loophole, how law enforcement is able to therefore then purchase personal data from third parties not covered under ECPA, like data brokers, and essentially evade the requirements that are laid out in that law. So it is a legislation that directly addresses that, which is great, because that's one of the big problems that we identified here, and that has led to many of these other instances of transactions between law enforcement and data brokers. But one of the things that it doesn't do is it doesn't cover all types of sensitive information. So, for example, biometric information, which could include, iris scans or fingerprint information or so on, is not directly covered or explicitly covered under the current language of that Fourth Amendment It's Not for Sale Act in terms of restricting what law enforcement intelligence agencies can purchase from data brokers. So there are some gaps there, but we argue that this is, as a first step, would be a huge improvement over the current situation where this loophole exists.
Okay. Given the current level of gridlock in U.S. Congress, how hopeful are we that we can actually pass, meaningful privacy legislation in the near future, or some of these other maybe restrictions around law enforcement use of the data if we can't get direct privacy legislation?
Yes.
But, if we can't fully restrict data collection, make things by default opt-in, some of the things that GDPR has done, would it at least be helpful to mandate more transparency or at least, opt-out type of requirements?
I think you're right. The politics of Congress makes it difficult to predict passage of laws. But transparency, greater transparency is definitely another way forward. I think one area is in requiring law enforcement intelligence agencies to provide more transparency in their procurement processes, right? Because that's what we're talking about here. So how they purchase, the kinds of purchases of data that they have from data brokers. So going back to the problem I mentioned, solicitations, procurement awards, they should actually have meaningful, comprehensive descriptions of what is being bought and sold, right? So that we can better understand that. But similarly, maybe data brokers should also be more transparent about what's happening. One example, if you look at telecommunications providers, right? They often publish, and these are major cell phone companies, right? They often publish reports about requests, listing all the different kinds of requests that they would get from law enforcement intelligence agencies for data, as a means of just providing greater transparency to the public about their engagement with law enforcement. And similarly, we can imagine how data brokers could do this as well, right? So there could be other steps that we could take besides what would be the ideal is like passage of legislation like Fourth Amendment to Not for Sale Act, or even better yet, like broader privacy legislation that would include provide a clearer regulatory regime for data brokers themselves, right? But there are maybe other steps that could happen in terms of improving transparency, both for like law enforcement and maybe on data brokers as well.
Like I know in some cases, and I may be thinking about foreign cases here, but I know in some cases it's required to let data subjects, and just because I say the word, and now I think it's got to be GDPR, know when their information has been requested by law enforcement. Like part of the transparency is not just generally speaking what we're allowed to collect and who we're allowed to collect it from, but I need to notify Kerry Parker that the FBI has requested his records for this, this, and this. Do we have any such notions of those kind of things in the United States, or whether or not we do you think that would be helpful in this case?
It's just at what point do we implement? I think it would be very helpful. We can imagine, for example, your interaction with a service provider, like a social media platform or your cell phone company, providing you with that kind of information about law enforcement requests and so on. But in the case of data brokers, as we discussed earlier, there are just so many intermediaries and so many steps involved. Like something we didn't get into was that, in the absence of comprehensive privacy legislation here in the U.S., what we end up with is a reliance on privacy policies among these different service providers and data brokers themselves, right? They also have privacy policies, right? But what happens when you have this very complicated supply chain is that you don't have a direct relationship with a data broker. So, for example, I have no idea which data brokers have my data, right?
Right.
Who do I go to? Whose privacy policy should I look for, and to review, right? And even where you may engage with a provider, a platform, cell phone provider, or others who have clear privacy policies, including what they share or do not share with third parties and what third parties can do with that, it still becomes complicated. Like in one example that we highlight, there was a study that looked at medical apps, like on Android, that, for example, track your medical information, your health, your exercise, and so on, right? And they looked at the privacy policies of those apps and found that they allowed for sharing of user data with third parties, including brokers for like advertising or analytical purposes, right? And they said that it's okay because the user data that's shared with them would be subject to the privacy policies of those third parties. But when they went to those brokers or those third parties and looked at their privacy policies, they did not cover the user data. They only focused on the client, which was the mobile app developers.
Right.
So now we have this kind of, you end up with the user going in circles, right? Because they're being referred from one back to like the specific third party policy and so on. And there's a lack of clarity there. So that's the other complication there about where at what point, going back to your question, at what level can we effectively inform the user of what's going on and effectively inform them about what might be available, what kind of rights might be available under which policy, right?
Right. Well, and just to add even more complexity to this, and to illuminate why this is so difficult, particularly in the United States, is we have so many different government agencies that are that are overseeing different aspects of this, and that may come into play here. We've got the Federal Trade Commission, we've got the Federal Communications Commission, we've got Consumer Financial Protection Board, to some extent the Department of Justice. So in your view, what government agency or agencies should oversee privacy rights? From a jurisdictional perspective, is that really part of the problem? We've just got such a patchwork quilt and all these different hands in the pie.
Well, yeah, I think so there are many different questions of jurisdiction there, but I think the FTC has a significant role when it comes to enforcing consumer privacy rules, which can include regulations around data brokers. One of the problems, though, is around funding for the FCC and its ability to actually enforce those rules,
right,
which, as you described, is quite complex. We're dealing with many different levels. So there's a resource issue that's one of the things we argue for in the report. But yeah, I think the FTC can be a starting point here, as long as there is sufficient capacity and resources to actually enforce and address some of these problems that we're outlining here.
But okay, so maybe what I'm driving at here is, do we need a new organization? Do we need a new government entity specifically around privacy to kind of bring all this under an umbrella? And then maybe, another problem with some of these agencies is there's a lot of political appointees going on with some of these agencies. So just look at the FCC. I mean, we had net neutrality that was set to take place under Wheeler in the Obama administration, and then we changed administrations. We got Ajit Pai, and it completely reversed. And in fact, in some ways, between the FCC and Congress, kind of almost banned further efforts at privacy and net neutrality. So all these political issues, and you're right. If it's not directly by appointing somebody with political leanings into a position of power in some of these oversight agencies, it's purse strings. It's managing. It's gutting the funding. There. I mean, that is the way the U.S. Like it or leave it, that's the way the government works. But so do you guys have specific recommendations going forward about how we could address that aspect of this? What are you recommending that we should be doing to set up some sort of a regulation regime that would be functional?
Yeah, I think on a more significant level is the legal, legislative, and other loopholes that we point to, right? Mm-hmm. Which would have to be addressed, I think, as a first step.
Sure. Yep.
Because then without that, you still leave these agencies with, basket to carry water. So, all right. Now, with the other problem you're talking about is this kind of high degree of politicization of basically everything that's happening in government, which is so this you're right. This has a very complex kind of layout to everything else in terms of how you effectively address the problem with data brokers. It's a difficult one. I mean, it's hard to envision, a reduction in this degree of influence of politics in administrative affairs, and it's a tough one to get around. But I think having the right laws in place and then the right resources and funding to these agencies will be a big step forward. We can also complement that by maybe addressing the transparency problem we talked about earlier, but also maybe shedding more light. And this is something the government can do itself, right? Through maybe more hearings to examine what's happening with data broker sales. And if emphasis on foreign governments, for example, important point you raised earlier, if we can have hearings that could maybe shed more light on that, could in turn shed more light on the data broker ecosystem as a whole, right? That could be one way of getting mutual political agreement around a significant problem when it comes to foreign governments accessing the data of Americans, right?
Yeah.
We could also definitely need more research, I think. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, could also take the lead on that. For example, just getting a sense of the scale of government transactions. So how much does the government spend on purchases from data brokers? We don't know. But just getting that could give us, a sense of the significant scale of the problem here. And so that providing more information on expenditure, on engagement with foreign governments, just providing more information on that could support momentum to push forward with some of these changes that we've called for here as well.
Yeah, that's actually a great recommendation. We get caught up in a lot of these the news stories and about the government agencies that are unfortunately very politically driven. But there are several organizations within the U.S. government that are not, and the GAO is ostensibly one of them. And a lot of times we do get really interesting and insightful reports from agencies like that are non-political, which is great. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. All right, so where do we go from here? What other things is your organization working on, or maybe other rights groups working on right now? And what do you recommend that we do, as consumers and as citizens, to support privacy rights in your efforts here?
I think we're looking at this broader problem here of just being aware of what's happening, and the problem of there are attempts to make it difficult for us to have better awareness, right? There's lack of transparency. But if those of us in like civil society groups, like advocates, journalists, and everyone, public at large, right, can just have more awareness of what's happening here between data brokers, how data brokers are collecting and selling our information, and more importantly, how they sell that to law enforcement intelligence agencies, I think is a significant step. So the more that people are aware of the ways that their rights are being undermined, I think is very important. We produce this report, Legal Loopholes, to really raise awareness, particularly among policymakers, about this problem, what they can do, but also the wider public. But at a more public level, I think just having that awareness will also be important. So there are several recommendations that we have in the report, some of which we mentioned, but others are there. I think those are all important first steps. But just generally, and I appreciate the fact, Kerry, that we're having this conversation because of your audience, and maybe your listeners will benefit from this conversation, at least in the sense of increasing their awareness of this problem. And then we can also address that in different ways, whether we are in the advocacy space or as journalists or as ordinary citizens, and who engage with our representatives in Congress, right?
Yes. And obviously, groups like yours, I'm sure, are happy to take donations. A lot of time, what I recommend to folks is they don't have the time to get out there, and you don't have to go out there and protest in the streets and attend all the town halls yourself. There's a lot of groups like yours that are out there every day doing the work on your behalf, whether you pay them or not. And slip you guys a little bit of money to help you do what you do.
Yeah, please check. I mean, if you check out our website, cdt.org, you'll find all this information, including this report, but also about us, and also ways that you can support our work as well.
Well, Dhanaraj, that was extremely important and enlightening, and thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us all about it.
Thank you so much, Kerry. It's been a great conversation. Thank you again for inviting us.
Thanks again to Donnarus for coming on the program to talk about this. I realize that, this can sound kind of policy and wonkish and whatever, but it really, really is important. And again, the real takeaway here is that all of this corporate tracking, this stuff that is ostensibly around serving us better ads and giving us a more personalized experience on the web, and that's the euphemism they often use, right? Which really just amounts to, I want to collect as much information about each and every person as I possibly can and sell it on this gray market of data where basically everyone's saying, in their privacy policies or whatever, well, we don't abuse it, but what we really end up doing is making sure that the people that buy this information from us pinky swear that they're not going to abuse it, and we really put the onus on them. And then the people that buy it basically point back to the people that bought it from and say, well, no, it's really their problem. And at the end of the day, what really happens is there's very little control over any of this stuff. And certainly in the United States, there's just no regulation around it. And so all this data is swimming out there, and a lot of people, don't know what's really out there, what's being collected. And what's really scary is all the correlations of this data. All the first party data is bad enough, right? The things that Google and Facebook and Microsoft and even Apple, the things they know about you directly, and the websites you visit, the things, Amazon, the things they know about you directly, that's one thing. And if I'm only sharing it with those guys and they only used it for making my experience better, maybe I can see that. But the problem is that they are sometimes, even unwittingly, making this available to third parties, because a lot of these apps, for example, on your phone, a lot of these apps include these SDKs, these free software development kits that do something really useful, like maybe it's shopping cart functionality or something else that's kind of a pain to re-implement. Why reinvent the wheel? Someone's already done it and they did a really good job. So I just want to reuse that widget. I want to take that part. But by using that software development kit under the covers, what you're really doing is also sharing a bunch of information with that company or organization or whoever wrote that SDK, because it's free for a reason. I mean, they got to make money somewhere. So a lot of times, even the app developers that are making these apps that are siphoning off this data don't even realize it's happening, because it's some little chunk of software that they reused and from someplace else that was free that, made it easier for them to write their app. And in the background is siphoning off your information. And so all this information is pooling out there and being collected and shared and traded and correlated. And it's just a gold mine for law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies, and not just ours, foreign governments. And that's really what this report drives home. And that's why this is such an important thing. And by the way, something we didn't really talk about today, but is important to understand, is that we have agreements with a lot of other governments, like what we call the Five Eyes countries. Five Eyes being five, democracies: the United Kingdom, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand. I think that's all the Five Eyes. We have intelligence sharing agreements. So while it might be illegal for the NSA to spy on U.S. citizens, it's not illegal for a foreign government to do it. In fact, it's done all the time. So what's to prevent the NSA from going to, I'm probably going to screw this up, MI6 or whatever, one of these foreign intelligence agencies are, and say, well, I can't spy on this citizen because it's a U.S. citizen and he's in the United States, but could you spy on him and give me that information? And maybe all they're really doing is going to these data brokers and buying that info and then making it available. It's super murky and it's really creepy. And it's because we don't have guardrails on this stuff like we should. And this report just highlights that. So the Center for Democracy and Technology, that is at cdt.org. They are doing great work. You can follow them on social media. You can also send them money to help support what they're doing. I would highly recommend it. I've got a link in the show notes. You can also read the report yourself. I've got a link to that in the show notes as well. It takes you to a website. You can download the PDF. You don't have to read the whole thing. You can kind of skim it, but there's like a key findings part at the beginning. And at the end, there's like a section of what they recommend that policymakers and data brokers do in response to, some of these abuses that they found. And, you can kind of look at just those sections probably and get a lot of it. But hey, it's worth checking out and skimming and maybe sharing around. All right, so I promised a couple announcements. I think I said last week that I might be doing this, and now it is official. I am definitely doing it. I am going to hold a virtual online holiday party for my patrons later this month. We're still trying to work out the date and time. I've got a little poll out for my patrons, trying to find the best time where I can get most people to show up. But right now it's looking to be like a 90-minute Zoom session. I'll probably have a few opening remarks or something, and then we'll have some drinks, we'll do some Q&A, and just kind of hang out and chat. So if that sounds interesting to you, maybe now would be a great time to become a patron. Go to patreon.com and look for Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. And of course, there's a link in the show notes. Now at that party, I've been working on kind of a neat little side project. Actually, it's really, really cool that I cannot wait to talk about. And I'll probably at least tease that at the party. So even another little reason you might want to show up to the party is I've got an interesting little announcement that I'm going to be making for something I'm working on for next summer. It might even involve creating a whole special patron level because I'm making something, and that something I'm making would be a great thing to give away to my patrons. And of course, at any point, you can become a patron and talk to me on Discord. All my patrons have access to that, and you can just chat with me anytime on Discord too. So if you want to interact some more with me, give me some feedback, ask me some questions, or just talk about whatever, the way to do that is to become a patron. Now, I am also doing free webinars, at least for small audiences, on privacy and security. I've done several of these already. I've got a nice little canned prezzo that I follow with Q&A, and I've given it to several small groups. And if you have a group that might be interested in that, reach out to me. You can find a contact form on my website under the contact tab. And of course, there's also a link to that in the show notes. So next week, we've got a new show. Plenty to talk about. If you haven't heard about the Life 360 tracking debacle, I will talk about that. We'll talk about this Verizon tracking program. There's a really cool big security update that just came into Firefox, and plenty of other things to talk about. Lots of news to catch you up on. And after that, I'm going to have a special holiday show, and then we'll be into 2022. So lots of great stuff coming. Subscribe if you haven't already. That way you won't miss anything. I hope you're all having a good December so far. I hope you're getting ready to have a really nice holiday break. Remember to help your friends and family while you've got a little extra time with them, to help secure their stuff, give them some good pointers, and help them, set up and configure any of these smart devices they may be getting for Christmas that might also be siphoning off a bunch of their data. All right, everybody, take care. Stay safe out there, and until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.